So it has been 10 days since we did these morpholine reactions and set the material in the freezer. Did those on the 19th of January. It's now the 29th. And I'm going to go collect them from the freezer. I've been watching them periodically. And after about 3 days, we started seeing some crystals in that cold reaction. So that was 46A, and you can see there are a lot of crystals in there now. The hot reaction, unfortunately, is not crystallizing, so we're going to have to mess with that one. And then we have what was the liquid distillate. It's solidified in the freezer because that product has a freezing point that's just slightly below room temperature. So we're going to take these over and let them come to room temperature. Since this one's the solid, we'll work with that one first. And then this one we're going to get an IR once it's warm. I don't want to open it until it is warm. This one we're going to need to mess with. So we're going to get a filter assembly for that. A 25 milliliter filter flask and one of these adapters and a nice clean Hirsch funnel. A piece of filter paper out. Easier to pull that out with some tweezers. Just want one. And I'm going to grab a glass stirring rod. I don't want those to fall over. So I'm actually going to use these heating blocks to hold them so they stay upright, so we don't lose anything there. And we're probably going to want an ice bath so we can cool some ether. We're going to want to use cold ether to rinse that with. So I'm going to cool a little bit of ether in a 50 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask so it's ready when I need it. I'm going to grab some pipettes. Probably going to need several. Once we'll have them ready. Already have a 25 milliliter Erlenmeyer. It's got acetate in it though, so I'm not going to use that one. Grab a couple extras. This assembly can get clamped. And attached to the vacuum. Ether is so volatile that there's no point wetting this down with ether until I'm ready to do the actual filtration. So I got a fairly nice amount of solid on there. I think in the lab manual it says to mechanically remove those first, but it'll be a whole lot easier to mechanically remove those from the filtrate than to reach through that large quantity of solid. So I'm going to ignore the lab manual and modify the procedure just a little bit there. So if we reach in there with our glass stirring rod, we can try to break that solid up a little bit. And the glass stirring rod really isn't going to get the job done. It's too thick on the bottom. Probably going to need a micro spatula for that. Nice pointy tip on the micro spatula. Pretty much all solid. Obviously, since there was no solvent for this reaction, we've got a lot of solid. So we're going to be using cold ether as our filter aid. Just put a squirt of ether in there. Stir that up, make a uniform slurry out of it. Quickly wet that with ether to make sure all the holes are sealed. And then we want to filter that out and try to help the solid come out. We get a nice, almost colorless crystalline solid. You can see that I have to be a little careful how much ether I use because there's some solid that's going to be in the bottom there. So there's a trade-off between rinsing it with cold ether to get the residual solid out of the vial and losing more solid through dissolution. The yield is not critical here. We're mostly after identity, figure out what's been produced. But there's no point throwing away material that we can get unnecessarily. So I'm not going to worry about that little bit. So all I'm going to do now is take one more squirt of the ice cold ether just to wash down the pipette and rinse the solid. Set that aside. Those are clean. We got some solid down there, which we could get if we wanted to. Probably the initial filtration lost some of that solid around the edges. So we'll just get another 25 milliliter filter flask. Break that vacuum. Switch flasks. And a little bit of cold ether. Ether evaporates so quickly. So ice that down. Limit its solubility. And then you'll just filter that back through. Try to get the rest of that solid to stay on top. And a tiny bit of wash, not very much this time because we don't want to lose compound. And that should be good. We'll just let that sit there for a bit. There's a little bit of solid left, but not enough to be worth worrying about. And you can see there's a little bit more solid coming in the ether. It's somewhat soluble. So let's grab a 10 milliliter beaker. And we'll label this up and get a mass. This is going to be DCl-10-46B, the purified material. That beaker has a mass of 8.125 grams. Got 8.125 grams on the beaker. I'm just letting a little air go through. It won't take long because of ether. But because ether is so volatile, it's probably cooling quite a bit as it evaporates. Which means that we are likely introducing a little bit of water. So I will be storing this in the desiccator. So I'll just break the vacuum. Probably going to need that again, so hopefully going to need that again for the other solid, so I'll just stick it over on the air for now. Need that again too. Got a little bit of solid on there. Oops. Lost it on the bench. Oh well, not worth it. So we got our 3 molecular sieves in there along with this solid. It's somewhat crystalline. It's not the powder that some solids like this are, but the crystals are fairly small. Make this so the solid doesn't all release all at once. If I can leave the piece of filter paper behind, that would be great too. One less thing to pull out of there with tweezers. It's a little sticky, which means that it's still a little wet with water. So now what I need to do is take those sieves out of there. Take just the sieves, and as little of the solid as possible. And crunch that up a little, making sure it's a nice uniform solid. So it will dry nicely in the desiccator. I'm going to get a mass now just in case I forget later. But obviously I can get a more accurate mass after it's been in the desiccator. So we're looking at 9.494 grams now. And we'll do our usual trick of nesting that 10 ml beaker inside a 50 so it won't fall over, and sticking it in a desiccator. Next to all the others. You can see why it's important to actually label everything so I don't get those solids mixed up.